And Kohberger was also watching material on YouTube related to Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, but Bundy certainly appeared to have been his favorite. You can see here several cached images from YouTube showing that Kohberger had watched and saved shows featuring the movie American Psycho, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ed Kemper, and more.
And then Law and Crime mentioned something else.
Also followed shows that discussed the Moscow Murders investigation, and he watched the Moscow Police Department's video updates on the investigation. Now, this is just a small sampling of what Kohberger was watching online when it came to the case.
Law and Crime doesn't mention which, quote, shows, unquote, those were, but these are, of course, true crime channels, competitors to themselves. And I wouldn't have known about this, as these days I actually hardly watch Law and Crime myself. I don't really watch a lot of live streams either, except just a few minutes ago, someone following my channel posted this comment. So have a closer look at some of those videos that are shown on screen, alongside videos of serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. The Idaho killer was also watching press conferences from Moscow PD, and one video from one particular true crime channel regarding his case. This video.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Significantly, it was posted on December 27th, I'm talking about my video, before we knew who Kohberger was, and even more significantly, just 2 days before he was arrested. You can imagine what was going on inside his heart and mind. They were closing in on him, and he knew it, and he was kind of going out of his mind. And so he was watching certain things to try and figure out what people thought and what people knew. And you can see why the title of this True Crime Rocket Science video appealed to him. It was titled, "Nothing Was Out of the Ordinary." For a dude hoping and praying that he was getting away with his foul deeds, he really needed to believe this was true. But was it true? Well, the video dealt with that. Before we get to that, though, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, probably later today, I'll be uploading another video in the Twisted Tale analysis on the Amanda Knox documentary, so look out for that. Also, thank you so much to Acid and Rain for alerting me to this. I wouldn't have known without your comments, so thanks again for that. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started.
You know, it is remarkable that there was nothing remarkable that night, that the girls seemed to be behaving normally. In your investigator's mind, what is remarkable about that? What can we infer?
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Nothing was out of the ordinary. How does that translate to the number 5 clue we all missed? At 1 minute 37 within this News Nation clip, and I'll put a link to that in the description, the reporter says, "You mentioned that it is remarkable that there was nothing remarkable that night." Former CIA and FBI agent Tracy Walder makes such an excellent point, saying at every stage along their journey home from the Corner Club, they had no reason to believe they were in danger. So we get remarkable insight just in that from them, that they didn't perceive any unusual threat. Not from someone they knew and not from a stranger. Of all the experts that you hear talking about true crime, I find Tracy Walder to be the best. But even so, I've tended to take the opposite view, that this crime didn't happen because everything was perfect. Something had to be wrong for someone. But if we take Walder's statement at face value, that all along their trip home that night, the walk to the food truck, the interactions around the food truck, the drive home in the taxi, if we accept that there wasn't anything remarkable about that, and that it was normal behavior for them, I think it raises an interesting question. And this is the vital 5th clue that we've all missed. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the thousands of you that have subscribed and also the dozens of you that have joined Patreon. If you're enjoying this episode, please share to your social media and networks that are discussing this case. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So, in what way could their quote-unquote normal behavior be upsetting to someone in particular? And we sort of covered that with a little bit of sound clips from Elliot Rodger. How could someone else be behaving normally be upsetting to someone in particular? Well, if they didn't perceive danger, if the victims didn't perceive any kind of danger in terms of the events of that night, isn't it because the danger arose on some other night, or as a result of an accumulation of perception from someone else? In other words, was the breaking point, the inflection point for someone who's related to this case? Was it 3 weeks earlier, 6 months earlier? What is the period of time we need to be looking at? I think it's also interesting to remember this idea that the neighborhood of the funhouse, as well as the funhouse itself, was particularly, in fact peculiarly, silent for a Saturday night. And so how could that context be triggering? I suppose one theory we could draw from this is the idea that if you're not having a party and not doing things with all your favorite people, then who should you be hanging out with? Who should you be reaching out to? If you've been too busy partying and with friends, who should you be paying attention to that you haven't? And in that context, if you then still don't pay attention to that person, what does that look like? What does that feel like? So while Walder's take on the events is a useful way to think about it, that it was all very, very normal, and while this does actually negate behavior arising out of some negative incident that night by someone who was directly part of their interactions in public, I do think we must reconcile that thinking with the idea that their interactions were nevertheless meaningful and not entirely without incident. The business of what was told to Adam and telling Adam everything and ditching a puppy-eyed Romeo hanging out on the sidelines, I think that even if it's normal, is nevertheless a fabric that someone else found themselves in, and it didn't feel very good to them. Does that make sense? Once again, all of this normalness, how could that feel unpleasant to someone else? You might also say, I had a normal Christmas, and someone else might respond to that thinking of it in a painful sense, perhaps because they didn't. As adults, our identities and pairing and future paths have been settled, right? But at this age, all of these aspects are in flux. And in some ways, it might be a fairy tale that is starting to come true for some, while for others, it might be a nightmare. For someone, their identity, their partner, perhaps even their lifetime partner, and thus their entire future was in tatters, while Kaylee and Maddie were going on with a normal night. Now remember, this video was posted on December 27th. It was 2 days and a couple of hours before he was actually apprehended at his parents' home. If Bryan was listening to this, we know he watched it. If he was listening to it, do you reckon it hit him on the chin a little? Was this accurate? Remember, this was posted before we knew who he was or what he looked like. But I think it's clear I knew what he looked like psychologically, and if he watched this, so did he. He knew that we knew, or at least some folks out there knew who he was psychologically. Let's listen to a little bit more. Or as Maddie's father said, she was just getting the life that she deserved. Well, who wasn't? Now, you may not think so, but for someone who lacks a certain kind of agency, a breakup can instantly and irrevocably change the course of their life history. Your destiny and fate can swivel from somewhere warm and fuzzy to somewhere else cold and lonely at the drop of a hat, or perhaps the drop of a hint. So that is the number 5 clue we all missed, right? And it has to do with it being completely normal for the victims. And in what way was that unsettling to the perpetrator? Now, in the Kaylee Rodney case, when we reached around this point, the number 5 clue, number 6 clue, that was when we eventually found out what had really happened with Kaylee. Well, we're now moving beyond that milestone in terms of this case. How many clues is it going to take to actually solve this? So I'm not going to take it further than that, but I am going to deal with something else I've been meaning to address, and it comes from the same News Nation clip. It's this image. Look at the words on the banner: brave, bold, unstoppable. You can imagine the kids in the funhouse seeing those words and being inspired by them. I think this video in context is a reminder that criminals occupy the same world, the same fabric. They are exposed to the same media and social media that we do. They're exposed to many similar things. Their filters are just very different. And look at how Kohberger, after the fact, was still stimulating his mind with serial killers, people who inspired the world with fear, but also awe, criminals who exerted a kind of sadistic power over the public for as long as they weren't caught. I noticed the law and crime commentators saying somewhere, "In my heart of hearts, I believe Kohberger would have done this again." For me, that's a strange comment to make, firstly because Kohberger was terrible in how he executed this crime. And it's one of the reasons why, not just if you don't commit it very well, the era of the serial killer is really over right now, just because of the surveillance technologies that are out there in the world. So I really don't believe that he could have done it again. Secondly, whatever he wanted to do, I highly doubt there was any other outcome except that he would have been caught in this particular case. And the other thing is, he just wasn't serial killer material, I think, because he's too anxious and also not very smart. I suspect the comment that Kohberger would have become a serial killer is to do with speculating early on that he was a serial killer to begin with. That was something that I never believed at the time, again, without actually knowing the information to begin with. Now, one thing I did find useful in the discussion about his browser history is that his porn searches were all about non-consensual sex, something that he had in common with Rex Heuermann. And I'm sure when Kohberger fantasized, he was well aware that in the real world, girls rejected him. So a consensual fantasy was basically science fiction, not particularly realistic as far as he was concerned. But it does bring us back to what I said way back then as well, when I said, his motive was sex. Yes, he didn't commit a sexual act, but the crime was driven largely, though not exclusively, by a sexual impulse. But a sexual impulse, in this case, was to dominate and forcefully, to assert his manhood. That is why I wanted to use a knife as well. A power struggle is definitely part of the motive, but I believe the quintessential part is the sexual part, which is where Kohberger felt his impotency as a human being most keenly. And you can imagine at the college level, it's the most invalidating place to be invalidated in that way. Again, Heuermann felt the same way. He was also bullied and humiliated by girls in the classroom setting. And he, like Kohberger, was also a mama's boy. Interesting that you've got these similar ingredients. What else did I say in that video? I get a sense that Kaylee, for one, had transformed a great deal from a little girl with a little boy boyfriend to someone a lot more sophisticated. Her new vehicle also communicated that sense of herself. Kaylee went from this to this. In other words, she upgraded herself and her car. What else happens when you, as a person, upgrade your life? You may move somewhere else. You may move onto a different job and a different income, a different lifestyle. But you can also sever certain linkages that you consider downgrades to yourself, or something that you have transcended in a way, such as an old car or a high school sweetheart. Gabby Petito was also in the process of trying to upgrade who she was. Bryan, meanwhile, in that scenario, seemed to want to keep things under control. He wanted to keep things sort of the way they were, keep his girlfriend the way she was, keep the status of their relationship in a sort of stuck sense. But the ships of youth aren't made for harbors. They're designed for the open seas and for living. And when one ship wants to sail out of that harbor and another one wants to sort of tie it down, anchor it down, well, that is a recipe for crisis and heartache. On the 18th of October, around the 3-week mark to the murders, the University of Idaho Facebook page posted this mantra: brave, bold, unstoppable. Although it isn't exactly clear what Kaylee decided to be with Jack, but ending a serious 5-year relationship is huge no matter how old you are, but when you're 21, it's particularly huge. You're basically deciding to change your own and someone else's destiny. Now, you may think semantics and the University of Idaho marketing are accidental or incidental to operative everyday psychology. But when you think about it, on social media, we are constantly aware of messages that can and do reinforce how we do or how we want to feel about certain things. Well, that's about the 9-minute mark of the 25.5-minute video that I posted on the 27th of December. You can actually hear and see how my YouTubing has evolved in that 2-3 year period as well. Also thanks to other people that have been helping me. So you can see to what extent, if you are evolving and someone else isn't, and this is also true on YouTube, it can feel very invalidating. Now, I guess what I was trying to show is what was normal for everyone else, lives changing for the better. That was a nightmare for Kohberger, because if they were evolving, upgrading, he was downgrading and devolving socially. And these are a couple of the other videos I posted at the time. We know from his searches that Kohberger was a big fan of Ted Bundy. Bundy was showcased on Netflix a few times starting in 2019. Does anyone remember that Dahmer was big on Netflix in the run-up to the murders? It dropped on Netflix on September 21st, just 2 months before the murders. And you remember these headlines at the time. Another title was, "Did the Idaho Killer Work Here?" And I think I was quite close. He did work at a fish farm in Pennsylvania, though, cutting up the bodies of animals. And so I wonder how many of these Bryan watched. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I will post a link to the original video in the description. You can also just wait till the end of this video for a link to that video. But something I think is really interesting is that I said at the number 5 clue mark, that was when we figured things out that's when we solved the Kaylee Rodney case. And I said something similar here. And that is literally just after that is when Kohberger was actually caught. So that was also quite interestingly quite prescient. Anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that. Let me know in the comments if you watched this video at the time. Again, look out for the next video in the Amanda Knox series. Bear in mind, I'm also doing a series on peripheral figures in the John Monet Ramsey case. The next video in that ought to blow your socks off. Well, that's it from me. Apologies for the croaky voice. I do have a bit of a sore throat. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.